Welcome to my Gothic review of The Devil and Mrs. Davenport by Paulette Kennedy. So this is a book Amazon kept recommending to me and I kept putting off because I thought the cover was too sunshiny and happy. It couldn't possibly be giving me that dark, gothic, unsure tenseness I wanted. Additionally, I think the summary is a little misleading because it talks about how Loretta has these ESP powers and she finds a psychologist who's helping her to hone them, and she's helping the police force, and all of that makes it sound like psychic power is common in this world and accepted, but this is actually a lot more like our real world setting where both of those things are like outrageous and unusual. I like when the supernatural is a little bit of a mystery and a little bit of like a special talent that we have to like learn about and overcome and kind of introduce into society in a way that they're willing to go with. But once I picked this book up and started reading it, I realized almost right away that this is like a gothic dream of a story. And I just wanted to get on here and gush about all the different points this tackles in our gothic spectrum. And just to remind everyone, there are 9 points on this channel that might make a book gothic. But of these 9 points, you only need 3 to qualify. So starting with number 1, we have the horror elements. The Devil and Mrs. Davenport is grouping starting at chapter 2. Loretta falls sick on the first day of autumn in chapter 1. She's well enough to get up and start doing housework again in chapter 2. And while she's picking up laundry to get it done, loses consciousness and has a vision of this girl being buried alive and basically murdered, which correlates to a missing girl they have in their neighborhood. And her experiencing this dead girl's last moments with her, like tasting the leaves, feeling her pain, that's all scary and tense on its own. But the true horror of it for me is she wakes up from picking up the things she's gonna do laundry with and she's hanging them out in the clothesline.
Oh my god, this woman was 100% disassociated. She has no memory of what she was doing, and her body continued to do chores. The horror.
And the scares just keep coming. We get this nice foreshadowing when she goes to her children's parent-teacher conferences. Her son is drawing disturbing photos that include their house crumbling and her being injured or dead. And her son is always saying kind of like creepy things about how she might not be alive much longer. And of course, beyond anything supernatural Loretta's experiencing, there's the fact there's a killer at large in this small town. There is threat and tension everywhere in the novel. And even if we overlook the killer and say,
well, it's unlikely that the killer's going after Loretta,
it becomes pretty clear early on there's some trouble in Loretta's marriage. She is stowing money away
just in case.
She's keeping a lot of like little minor things secret from her husband Pete, like walks into frame menacingly, sort of like towering over her, saying vaguely threatening things, suggesting that she wouldn't want to make him angry, that she needs to lose weight. All this kind of stuff creates a tension and sense of vague threat. And on top of all of that, there's internal horror as well, because Loretta struggles with depression and self-esteem issues. Combine that with the new vision she's receiving, and she's not really sure what's real, what's not. She's not sure if she's well enough to keep taking care of her children or live in society. And eventually she does go into a mental institute, and we get to experience the horrors that is 1950 mental care for women. They electroshock them if they get too excitable. They take Thorine. Eventually, they schedule Loretta for a lobotomy just because she had a small shouting match with another woman. Number 2, character is king. This is an emotional arc for Loretta, starting out in this like depressed, lacking confidence, small, meek state, and moving into like independence and self-actualization. So we get to know all of her inner thoughts and feelings, we get to see her in her process on this journey, and we get to kind of like come with her and root for her the whole time. Besides Loretta, there's several characters that we get to uncover more about. One of them is the doctor's sister, Barbara. She kind of like reveals her lore and becomes more of a character and not just like a secretary as time goes on. We also have Loretta's friend Gladys, the fact that she starts off just as Earl's wife and then slowly like ingratiates herself to Loretta, and eventually the two of them sort of become friends and confidants. All wonderful. And even if we think about like the main human antagonist, which is going to be Loretta's husband Pete, he starts out like misogynistic, yes, but perhaps like quote unquote normal for that time period. And then like there's these undercurrents of things, there's this stuff that Loretta fixates on when he talks, there's these little moments where you think
something isn't right.
And it slowly becomes revealed that Paul is actually like a recovering alcoholic, except he's not recovered at all, he's relapsed, and that he may or may not be cheating on Loretta, he may or may not treat their children with violence or derision. All of these little things are being uncovered about who he is. So number 3, more poetic prose. This one I can't give the goth point to. I love the book, it's got great pacing and tension, I ate this guy up, but there's not like any moment where I thought,
oh, that was done in like an especially different way that makes it stand out.
It's not the writing that does it here, it's the storytelling. I think that actually is a strength more than it is a weakness, because I've been complaining about a lot of modern Gothic works being just like too wordy, too repetitive, and too focused on this like emotional feeling and hitting it too hard. This story doesn't ever do any of that. Number 4, elements of longing and loneliness. Loretta is very isolated. It's just her and her children. There's no adult person in her life that she feels a connection to or feels she can talk to. And some of this is Pete's doing, some of this is just the setup of her life as a whole. But even if we go back to like Loretta's childhood, her mother died in a tragic accident in front of her at a very young age. And then it was just her and her father. So like this starved loneliness, desire for more and for connection sort of like primed her to latch on to anyone who gave her any positivity. Happened to be Pete in like a young religious revival moment. And examining other characters in the story, the doctor Loretta sort of ends up becoming more like peers and friends with rather than Dr. Patient. He's got into this whole ESP talking to the dead thing because his wife and child died tragically in Europe while receiving treatment for an illness, I don't remember what. And he holds like a lot of guilt about not being there for them, about them being overseas and away from him when they died, and he is just living in his family home with nobody else really around him in his life except for his sister. So most of our main characters have a palpable sense of isolation and inability to like reach out and rely on a social system. Number 5, delving into human mortality. The main thrust of this story is that Loretta is investigating murders of various girls in her town. She's literally talking to the dead, hearing about the afterlife, hearing about how their ends came about, and trying to get justice for them. But beyond that, there's the constant threat of death to herself, there's the feeling that her children are in danger, and there's death in her backstory as well, because she is still dealing with the loss of her mother at an early age, something that she and the doctor sort of relate upon because he's dealing with the traumatic loss of his wife and son. And I think as early as the 3rd chapter, we actually come face to face to the sorrow and loss of these girls, where Loretta goes to the funeral of one of the victims and speaks with the mother. So it's not just a fear that you could be next, but it's a recognition of that loss and those left behind. Next is going to be a supernatural element. Loretta's talking to the dead. She's able to pick up memories and thoughts of someone else when she holds a precious object. Sometimes the spirits just come and speak directly to her. She's able at one point in time to let a spirit take over her body completely. And there's some reference to the fact that she might be able to move objects with her mind with enough training. So it seems like there's quite a bit of like supernatural stuff. The doctor does think that there is some kind of scientific exploration and further study of this. They'll be able to explain it and perhaps train other people in it. But as it stands right now, it's just a thing that Loretta and a select few other people can do. Next is going to be questioning a character's mental health and reality. Mostly this is Paul questioning Loretta's mental health and eventually getting her committed. It's up in the air whether or not he believes her or not. Like, he could be putting her in the asylum specifically to control her, keep her away from the children, and so he can have an affair with someone else living in their house. It doesn't really matter at this juncture because the actual mental health facility is horrible. Pete has been horrible leading into this, and the state of the asylum and mental health care system for these women is also just like unspeakably terrible. The fact that Laura is getting electroshock therapy, she's getting regular doses of taurine, it's culminating into this moment where they're recommending she get a lobotomy. losing pieces of herself. She doesn't remember how she got to the asylum. She doesn't remember and isn't able to connect various memories. Like, things will sound familiar. We, the readers, will know exactly what happened and when, but she won't be able to pull it up or pull it together because of all these quote-unquote treatments she's been getting. They get so bad and go on for so long that she also even loses her ESP and her ability to like read objects or speak with ghosts, which has become like a core, essential, special thing to her and her personality. Like, what she feels makes her stand out and is something that she can use to give back to the world has been stolen from her. And because she can't do this anymore, she really does begin to question whether or not she could ever speak to the dead, or this has actually honestly all been a mental illness or delusion on her part, and maybe it would even be good for her to go through with a lobotomy. Maybe that's necessary treatment for her. This like moment doesn't last super long, which I appreciate, just long enough for us to be really afraid for Loretta, really concerned she's choosing the wrong choice, or that possibly we as readers have misread what's going on. Within maybe a chapter or two, she does break out. She gets to speak with the doctor, and he can confirm that while she's been in the asylum, the police followed up on all of her tips and information and basically proved everything that she said was true. Make use of folklore, superstition, and myth. Loretta's fever that gives her the ability to speak to the dead does happen on the first day of autumn. So there's like a little bit of mythic element when we go to like the wheel of the year, things dying and going dormant, starts in fall and hits its peak in the winter. There's a seasonal element that you could see play out here, but it's not using like any supernatural elements, any local myths, superstition, folklore. There's not like a spooky haunted house or an urban legend or anything like that. So I don't think I'm going to give the story that Gothic point, but there is some nice resonance in what's happening in the story, how things are progressing, and exactly what time it is in our calendar year. Like, starting in the fall, we come to a climactic moment like a week before Christmas, and then everything sort of like refreshes at the turn of the year. Has a nice echo moment, but I don't know that it would qualify for the superstition folklore element. And then last but not least is a strong sense of place. The Devil and Mrs. Davenport doesn't have what I would consider a traditional strong sense of place, like where there's a house or an isolated area that like has its own personality or whatever. Paulette Kennedy does use Mrs. Davenport's like original home as a very interesting metaphor for her marriage and the state it's in. The more she and Pete disagree, argue, fall apart, and Loretta begins to see her marriage as unsalvageable, the more cracks begin to appear in the ceiling and the walls and the foundation of her home. And she is the first one to notice, apt, because she's also the first one to realize her marriage is unsalvageable. And she's telling Pete,
"This is untenable. We need to get our foundation checked. We need, like, more work on our house."
the same way she might be saying like,
"Help me with this relationship. Validate me. Let's figure this out."
Pete is dismissive. But on top of that, there are some key moments. Pete comes back early from a trip, and his son is expressing to Loretta in secret that he doesn't like when dad is around and wishes he just stayed away. Unfortunately, Pete overhears him and goes to like beat the tar out of him. But before he can lay hands on his son, the bathroom from upstairs falls through the ceiling and separates the two. And this is wonderful imagery, both using like the foundation in the house as like a metaphor for their marriage, but also a great way to demonstrate that there's threat to Loretta's children without depicting child abuse on page. And the thing that perhaps is most interesting is when Loretta escapes the mental institute and wants to like sneak back into her house for a couple of like keepsake things that are still there. She gets to the home and realizes that it's like sunk in on itself and has been condemned by the local authorities, and her family's not even living there anymore, which really correlates to her marriage. While she was trying to leave, while she was thinking it was unsalvageable, proof here when she escapes the asylum Pete's committed her to without ever speaking to doctors, of the house just being gone like it was never even there, really speaks to the state of her marriage as a whole. So I'm counting that as a strong sense of place. On top of that, I think the historic moment we're in the 1950s, the research that went into that, some of the things that we know are canon to 50s time fits and the way mental health works, cars, walking to places, small towns, party lines on phones. Really gives a lot of ambiance and flavor and character to the place we're in as well. And that's gonna be my Gothic breakdown of The Devil and Mrs. Davenport by Paulette Kennedy. I love this novel. I can't get enough of it, and I highly recommend anyone who's even a little interested in it go on and read it. I am so thankful to my Women in Horror book group over on Fable because I wouldn't have read this without them, and it was a great time. But talk to me, do you have any 50s Gothic horror for me? Let me know in those comments down below. And if you've got this far and you've got nothing else to say to me, go ahead and leave me one of those autumn leaf emojis. And as always, keep reading.